the society was back in 1993 or 1994. I told the history of my mother's family, the Longs of Longwood. And I was like, well, 20 years hadn't been that long ago, so that's pretty good. Then I started thinking. I was a history major, not a math major. So I went, that was 30 years ago. And I was like, man, and it was at the August meeting, and we met at Brunswick Community College whenever I did that. But tonight I'm going to talk to you about my father's family, the Bennetts. Bennetts it's a quiet family. We're at the southern end of the county, a little bit spread out from Calabash all the way up into Ash and Exum. Then there's a little sprinkling around Bolivia, and there's a few up in Leland, and one or two over in Wilmington. But that's it. We're just a quiet family. But when I started researching this, it was actually the result of a historical society meeting when I started doing my research on the Bennetts. Back in February of 1988, at the Historical Society meeting, a group came from the Southport Historical Society, and they were talking, the members of the genealogy committee were talking about a program they were doing where they were celebrating 1787 to 1987, which is when North Carolina signed the Constitution. They didn't ratify it. They just signed it, which made North Carolina a state. So that 1787 was technically when North Carolina became a state. So they had a program where if you could prove your family lived in North Carolina in 1887, you could be a pioneer. You could be a century family for North Carolina. If you could prove they were here in 1787, you could be a pioneer family. Well, I was sitting there going, oh, I'm going to pioneer. I'm going straight. Because I knew Bennett's were here in 1790 from the first federal census. So I was like, I'm going to do the pioneer thing. So I talked to the ladies that came, got all the information, and they said, just put together a paper that talks about your family and prove to us your family were in North Carolina in 1787. So starting in February, I started working on it. I went to cemeteries. I went to the Register of Deeds office, court's office. I went everywhere. I had family members finding relatives and digging out Bibles and books and everything I can have. I worked all through that summer. By night, I worked at Bennett's Calabash Seafood, which are cousins of ours. I worked in the Myrtle Beach restaurant, because if you're a Bennett around Calabash, you worked in a Bennett's restaurant. That was just a prerequisite for being a member of the family. So by night, I worked at the restaurant, and by day, I did all this research. I even did one stint where at 2 a.m. in the morning, I got home from the restaurant at 2 a.m., and then at 7 a.m., I was at the old Bennett farm with Marvin Bennett. As he pointed out, there's where the old house was. There's the cemetery where Samuel's buried. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And so I gathered all this stuff up, and then finally in September, I was ready. I sat down at an old typewriter, and I started pecking, and had papers spread out on the dining table, drove my mother crazy because I had all these papers. But I typed everything up, and I came up with a copy, and this was my heavily white out copy from 1987 that I then photocopied about 4 times so you wouldn't be able to see everything, because I wasn't going to type everything over again. And at the November meeting, which was held on November 14th, I presented my paper to the ladies from the Southport Historical Society, and Miss Abby Bettany was the lady that took it, literally yanked it out of my hands, and she said, I've got something to read when I go home tonight. So about a week later, I got an envelope, and in it was my certificate. And this is this actual certificate that they sent me that says it was a Pioneer Family Certificate. And it was dated the 15th of November, 1988. So I was thinking, I remember when I got this thinking, she must have went home and read that night and filled the certificate out and sent it to me the next day. So that's how I always will remember that. It was on November 14th, 1988 was when I gave her the my paper. And so this was the certificate. And it's been with me ever since. It's been to college with me at UNC Wilmington. It's been to me in Myrtle Beach, and now it's back home. But it's always hung on my wall, and I've always been proud of it. So to start with the Bennetts, it's very simple. We've been here in the country since about 1710. The first Bennett to come was Joseph Bennett, and he arrived, according to who's telling the story. One person says they came from they entered Wilmington and then made their way into North Carolina. Another relative will say, no, came down through Virginia. So in 1710, there was no Wilmington. There was just Brunswick town. So I'm kind of leaning away from that. The cousin that told me the information that the Bennetts came through Virginia has done a lot of research up there. So that's where we came from. After Virginia, Wilmington, whichever one you want to go to, the Bennetts settled in Anson County, North Carolina, which is just outside of Charlotte, and stayed there a couple of generations. And then in 1787, the first known Bennett in my family to come to Brunswick County was Joseph Bennett. He came from Anson County and settled in the Exum community around, as I said, in 1787, 1788. Joseph is listed in the first federal census in 1790 as a resident of Brunswick County. Now, some little facts about Joseph. He was born in 1760. He was the son of William and Jane Bridgeton Bennett. He fought at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse under the command of Nathaniel Greene in 1781. Before coming to Brunswick County, he spent some time in Bladen County, North Carolina. Joseph married Elizabeth Little in 1792, who was the daughter of Joshua Little, and settled at their home, which they called the Oakneys. And in 1798, Joseph bought that from Joshua Little. And from my little research I've gotten in talking to the Littles, Joshua Little owned all of the Green Swamp. He owned a lot of property up there. So we don't know what brought Joseph here. He just kind of showed up in 1787 and started working, met Elizabeth was his wife's name, and they just went on from there. He was elected constable of the Smithfield District in Brunswick County. And in 1819, he died and is buried somewhere on his property in Exum. Nobody knows where he's buried. The children of Joseph and Elizabeth Little were James, Mary, Arthur, Joel, Jesse, Samuel, Susan, Winnie, and George. Joseph and Elizabeth's three surviving sons were Samuel, Joel, and Jesse. Joel and Jesse resided in the Ash and Exum communities, while Samuel left and moved down to what is known today as Calabash. Why do you think he would leave all of his family up there and move to Calabash, which back then was basically nothing? What's an idea?
Work. To go fishing.
Work?
Yeah, work.
Fisherman.
Go fishing.
Fishing?
Seafood.
Well, none of that was there yet, but there was seafood out there. But free land. The state of North Carolina owned huge tracts of land along the coast that nobody had claimed. So when he came down to there, and this was in the 18-teens, he settled down there, down in the Calabash area around 1814, but he entered a land lottery where the state of North Carolina was giving away land to anyone who could prove they were a resident, and they had to pay a fee, and their name was put in a lottery, and they were pulled out. He got 3 tracts of land totaling 1,000 acres for just a few, and back then it was just a few dollars. That's what he got for it. And that's how he settled down in that area.
This is Joseph.
No, this is Joseph Bennett, yes. No, I'm sorry. Samuel Bennett. Yeah. So, okay, so Joe, actually, you're right. It's Joseph Bennett. I got my names mixed up. I'm sorry. It was Joseph Bennett. We're going to talk about Samuel in a second. But yeah, Joseph Bennett is the one who got the came down and got all the land and stuff for there. Now, Joel, still Joel and Jesse. Joel married Sarah. We don't know her last name in 1811, and they had 9 children. Jesse married Martha Mintz, who was a daughter of Henry and Anna Peebles Sellers Mintz, and had 7 children. Okay. All right. Now, but Joel and Jesse stayed up in the Exum community, so our branch, or the branch of my family, is through Samuel. So Samuel Bennett, we've now entered the 2nd generation that's here. We've got a total of 6 generations we're going to talk about at Bennett's tonight. We're getting ready to enter the 2nd generation right now. Joseph and Elizabeth's eldest son was Samuel, born in 1792. His son, John Nelson Bennett, described Samuel as a respectable man. He was regarded by those best acquainted with him as being a man of excellent common sense and sound judgment. He was an industrious farmer, pious man, and a strict member of the Baptist Church, several years preceding his death. Samuel Bennett eventually became a Baptist minister and was a founding member of Beulah Baptist Church, which was founded in 1837. And this year, the church will be celebrating its 187th anniversary. And there are still descendants of Samuel that attend that church today. In 1818, Samuel married Anna Mintz, who was the daughter of Henry and Anna Peebles Sellers Mintz. Anna Peebles Sellers Anna Peebles Sellers' parents were Elisha and Mary Willis Sellers. Anna was born in 1800, one of 15 children, here in Brunswick County, and died in 1863. And she's buried in what's known as the Bennett Beck Cemetery, which is near Calabash. Now, as a little side note, Henry Mintz, Anna's father, was born in Cumberland County, North Carolina in 1774, who was a son of Wilhelm Mintz and Lucretia Edwards. And Lucretia Edwards was of Welsh descent. Wilhelm Mintz, along with his brothers Karl and Heinrich, came to this country in 1760 from Germany as Hessian soldiers in service to the King of England. They served in the French and Indian War, seeing action in Ohio Valley. After the war, Wilhelm, now William, he anglicized his name, continued to serve and came to Brunswick County and joined Governor William Tryon's forces in Brunswick Town. In 1771, he married Lucretia and moved her to Fayetteville, North Carolina, which was known then as Cross Creek. In that year, he left service to the king and later joined the American cause, fighting in the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge, served for a time with Francis Marion, and then fought at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, where he was wounded in the leg and foot. The army left him at a private residence, and when the war ended, he always had a limp from that wound he had at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. Now, while William was fighting, as the people around Cross Creek, or what's known as Fayetteville today, didn't have much sympathy for the American cause. So Lucretia moved her family back down here to Brunswick County and left word with her neighbors, if William comes home, tell him I've gone to Brunswick County. And that's where he can come and find me. Sometimes later, when William got out of the service, he limped back to Cross Creek and then found out his family was gone. So then, story goes, he limped from Fayetteville down to what is now Mincetown Road, which is between Grissettown and Shallotte, is where she settled. So he limped. One day he had 2 sons at this point. They were really small when he left to go off to war. So one day the two sons were playing in the yard and they looked and here comes this man limping, holding on to the fence. They ran and got their mother, Lucretia, and said, there's this man out here limping, grabbing onto the fence. Lucretia comes out, recognizes that's her husband, William, and goes running after him. So I kind of picture she's running after him, kind of like in Gone with the Wind when Melanie runs to Ashley's walking up. That's how I kind of picture it, is that, she's running up to him. And the two sons are just standing there like, who is this? Who is this man? So from what the story goes, it took a few months for his sons to kind of warm up to him because they hadn't seen him for many years. I think the youngest was just an infant and the oldest one was a year old from that. William and Lucretia had 5 sons: John, Henry, Francis Mary, Jonas, and James. And during this time, the spelling of the Mintz name, right now Mintz is spelled M-I-N-T-Z. It was originally M-E-N-T-Z, but then it also took on M-I-N-K-S, M-I-N-C-E, and then M-I-N-Z-E-S. Those are examples of how the Mintz name changed. But now it's finally just M-I-N-T-Z. Sometime around 1790, William Mintz went hunting in the green swamp and was never heard from again.
Oh, no.
They searched for him, they looked, and there was nothing ever found of him. So he just disappeared in the green swamp. So that's why I tell people, when I was little, my father used to go hunting in the green swamp, and hearing that story, I was like, oh no, I don't want to go up there and disappear in the green swamp like other people have all the time. So Samuel and Anna Mintz had 10 children. Alfred was the oldest, and we're going to talk more about him in just a little bit. Samuel J., who married Adeline Gore and lived here in Brunswick County. Between Hickman's Crossroads and Longwood, there's a little community called Bennett Town, and that is where Samuel and Adeline lived, and that's where they raised their children. They had 2 sons, Benjamin and George, and they had 3 girls. Benjamin, George raised their families in that area, and there is a cemetery there called Bennett Town Cemetery. It was founded in 1885, and that is where all of those Bennetts, as well as other people from the community, there's Longs, there's McLands, there's other people buried there from that area. But Samuel and Adeline raised their children there, but when they died, they were living down in Slope Point with one of their daughters. So Samuel and Adeline is buried at Slope Point, but the rest of their family is all buried at Bennett Town. Anne married Elias Long. Martha married John K. Gore, and they moved to East Florida. Henry P. moved to Georgia and married a girl named Caroline Wooten. He volunteered in the war, and when I say war, that's war between the states, or war of northern aggression, as they call it. But I love what people from Charleston call it, the late unpleasantness. So I kind of stay with the late unpleasantness because I think that's fun. But he volunteered in the war between the states, or the late unpleasantness, and 2 months after enlisting, he died in a hospital in Macon, Georgia. Joseph never married. He went to Virginia and served in the war and died in Lynchburg after fighting in several battles there. There was Asa, and he married Susan Thomas of South Carolina. He volunteered in Company C, 36th Regiment, and was captured at the Battle of Fort Fisher. He later died in Elmira Prison Camp in New York in 1865.
What's his name again?
Asa Bennett.
Asa.
Uh-huh.
There was a Bennett that they started when the assault on Fort Fisher began. They shot the flag down, the Confederate flag for the post flag, and they appointed a Bennett to go up the post and rehook the flag up.
Really?
But he was too heavy to make it up the pole. So
that sounds like Bennett.
they found a young guy named Kit Bland, to do it. And Kit,
Christopher
We can-
Columbus played.
Maybe that's probably not the reason why I had that story's not in our family. That
My
was a
step
bit, it
was
was
my
too big
family.
to go up the pole, but yeah.
It was my favorite.
Oh, okay. So,
Plans.
plans,
I'm a door.
the next son was Solomon, and he never married. He died young. John Nelson Bennett married Mary Biggs and wrote a journal in the war telling of his life story, including his family. While he was stationed at Fort Caswell in Southport, there was nothing to do. So they said, a lot of the times the men just sat around, they mustered, they did all that, but that was a lot of downtime. So he started writing his journal. And I've got a copy, this is my copy, the photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy times 100 probably, of his journal that he wrote. And that's where a lot of the family information has come from, is because of this journal.
Who's the author of that again?
John Nelson Bennett.
let's see, who was John's father?
John's father was Samuel.
Samuel.
His mother was Anna Mintz. The next child was Sarah Jane. She married Reuben Long. The next child, Benjamin, married Emmeline Tharp. Benjamin's family, or a branch of his family, are the ones that founded Calabash Seafood in Benjamin's Calabash Seafood. That's in South Carolina now. And Jonathan, he was never married. He died when he was young. Samuel died on August 5th, 1845, and was buried in a field beneath a cherry tree. He wished to be buried there because he said the land is what made him, and he wanted to be buried in the fields that he worked. The spot where Samuel was buried has been lost due to 130 years of plowing. So now, today, only his descendants can stand at the edge of this field and say, somewhere out there is where Samuel's buried.
Over yonder.
Oh yeah, over yonder, out there somewhere. Interesting story. In the 1930s, late 30s, early 40s, a field hand was plowing the field, and they were plowing that field with a mule and an old plow. And the guy said that while he was plowing, he felt something hit his leg, and he looked down, and there was a bone. He said it was long like a leg bone, so either this piece or that piece, whichever one. He picked it up and just looked at it, and when he realized it was the leg bone, he slung it in the air and went running up to the house, left the mule, left the plow, left everything, and went and told the owner's then was Allen Bennett, who owned the property, and told Mr. Allen that there's bones out there in that field. I am not going back out there ever again. So they coached him out there to say, where is this bone? Show us the bone. They could never find that bone, but he swore there was a bone, and that's why he said he just flung it in the air and left, but they never found the bone that this person plowed up. So the story was, well, he found one of Samuel's leg bones, and they couldn't find it, so they just kept on. And to this day, they still plow the field. Haven't found anything else. But that was the fun story. I thought, whenever I heard that, I just laughed. I could just picture going, I'm not going back in that field. There's bones out there. No, I'm not doing that. In the Bennett Beck Cemetery, which is near Calabash, there's a monument dedicated to the memory of Samuel Bennett Sr. and Anna Mintz Bennett. It lists all of their children, and the epitaph reads, they left us to the heritage of freedom, work, and worship. So that's the end of our second generation. So we had Joseph, Samuel, now we're moving to the third generation. And that generation we're going to talk about is Alfred Bennett, who was the oldest of Samuel and Anna's children. Alfred was born in 1820 and resided near Hickman's Crossroads, which used to be called the Old Iredell District of Brunswick County. Nobody knows why they call it Iredell. It's just one of those things that showed up on a map somewhere, and it's always been known as the Old Iredell area. In 1845, Alfred bought 100 acres from his cousin, Samuel Brandon Stanlin, and along with a portion of land inherited at his father's death, he established a home place that's still in his descendants' possession today. And that's where I live, is on that same plot of land. Hickman's Crossroads, right there, that whole area where Beulah Baptist Church and Manly Bennett Cemetery, all of that. In fact, my grandmother's house, which is right across the road, that was where his house, Alfred built his house. And that's where the family's been since then. Alfred was a carpenter by trade, and he farmed on the side. He had a craft for barrel making and would sell the barrels to companies in Little River, who would then ship them to Southport, Wilmington, and Charleston. But what he was most famous for were shingles, which was used to cover the roofs of people's homes. Shingles were made of cypress wood, which is water resistant. So all those old wooden shingles that you see, all of that on the older buildings and in pictures, stuff, that was actually cypress wood. While making the barrels, when they would cut the lengths to make the barrels, when they cut the ends off, and once that was all done, they would bind those bundles together, those end pieces, and sell them to people as shingles. Most of Alfred's property that he inherited and bought were filled with cypress trees. It was swampland. He would tell his family that today, I'm going in the swamp to cut cypress trees. Eventually it became, I'm going into the swamp to cut shingle trees. Then it became, I'm going to Shingle Tree Swamp to cut shingles. Alfred's home and that entire area around there became known as Shingle Tree, and the name is still used today. And actually, Shingle Tree there is a run of river, a small river. It runs through Meadowland Golf Course. But if you go down Hickman Road and when you see the golf course, there's a huge open area and you'll see the water. That is Shingle Tree, and the water runs through there. So as the trees were cut, Alfred and his sons would drain the swampland and clear the fields and clear away the roots and everything and make fields. He did become a successful farmer as well as a barrel and shingle maker, but he was most known for the barrel making. And that's what he did for the remainder of his life until he passed away. In 1851, Alfred married Mary Polly Long, who was born in 1830. And she was the daughter of Gabriel and Catherine Jenrette Long. They had 12 children. There was Jesse, Olive, another Samuel, Antoinette, Frank, Margaret, Isaac Jackson, Mary, Catherine, Joseph, Benjamin Julius, and George. So this is a picture of Alfred Bennett and his wife, Mary Polly Long. And I had that copy made from a Mintz cousin who had one. We could talk about how the Mintzes come in a lot more with the family coming up. But that is what Alfred and Polly look like. That's the first generation of photographs that I've been able to trace back. Okay. Now here's some interesting facts about the children of Alfred and Polly. Jesse Bennett married Lydia Margaret Mintz. Now, if you'll start noticing, Bennett's married their Mintz or Long cousins all the way down for about 100 years. So all of a sudden, these family is all intertwined. Family tree, it's grafting back into the stalk and going back out again, and then it comes back again. So Lydia was the daughter of Bryant and Eliza Nelson Mintz. Bryant Mintz, and this is an interesting fact, Bryant Mintz and Jesse's grandmother, Anna Mintz Bennett, were brothers and sisters. So this would make Jesse and Lydia first cousins once removed. If I've got that right. So, the next child was Olive Bennett, and she married John Nelson Bennett, and this is the start of 3 Mintz brothers married 4 Bennett sisters. So, Samuel J. Bennett, he married Lottie Halls, and they had 12 children. Yeah, these families get huge. After her death, he married a Carter woman. And funny story. Well, it's not funny, but it's a funny story. The Carter woman gave him TB as soon after they got married. So in talking to throughout the family, nobody remembers her first name except she was that Carter woman gave him TB. Now I talked to some of his grandchildren by Lottie Halls, and that's what they said. I'm like, well, what was her name? Well, that doesn't matter. That Carter woman gave Granddaddy TB. So I have yet to know who this Carter woman is, but it was a Carter woman. When he was about to die, Uncle Sam, as they called him, dispersed all his children out amongst the family and went to stay with his brother Julius Bennett until he died in 1902. Now, everybody's heard what TB is and how it's a lung disease. So the story was Uncle Sam got so bad he was coughing up all this stuff that just before he died, the story is he coughed up a hunk of lung. And right when he coughed up that hunk of lung, he died. So I'm like, okay, that's good to know. There's a hunk of lung somewhere out there. That was his. Antoinette was the next child. She was called Nettie and named after the Queen of France. She married Jim Mintz. Jim Mintz and John Nelson Mintz were brothers. Margaret, or Maggie, as she was called, married Sam Mintz. That's the third brother the family married into. The next child was Isaac Jackson. And poor Uncle Jackson. That's what everybody says, poor Uncle Jackson. He doped on morphine. And they have no clue how he got addicted to morphine, but he doped on morphine. And eventually that's what killed him. So here is a picture of Uncle Jackson that we have of him. And notice his eyes. When you come up and look at his eyes are really big. So there was Uncle Jackson, and he doped on morphine. So for years, the story was Uncle Jackson would take the morphine, and he would throw his empty bottles in a field, which was behind my family's pack house. So for years, when my grandfather and my father were plowing the fields, they would plow up bottles. So my grandfather would come in and say, well, here's another one of Uncle Jackson's bottles, morphine bottles. My grandmother washed them up, and she had a curio cabinet in her kitchen, and she set the bottles up there. So these are some of the bottles that Uncle Jackson threw in the field, and my grandmother saved and put on her shelf. So, yeah.
Cute.
As I say, only in the South, but something like that. You save the uncle's morphine bottles and put on the shelf.
Dug them out of the field.
Right.
Pansies was bit in there.
So that's our collection of some of the bottles of Uncle Jackson's morphine bottles. The next child was Mary, and she married Sam Mintz after the death of her sister Maggie. So her sister married Sam. Maggie died, and then Sister Mary went and married Sam again. Sam outlived Mary. So, and he had children by each sister. So I was saying earlier, his children are brothers and sisters to their first cousins, and they're also step-brother and sister to each other. You can try and work that out. But everybody there, like I said, it's just all mixed in. Catherine, or Aunt Sissy as she was called, married Bill Mintz. That was another brother. So, the next child was Joseph Bennett, or Uncle Joe, as they called him. He was a Baptist minister, and he did mission work in the mountains of North Carolina at the turn of the last century in 1900, 1902. while he was doing mission work in the mountains, he contracted TB and he got sick and sent word. And his brother Joseph went to the mission in Asheville, North Carolina, and brought Joseph home. While Joseph was up there, he started dating a girl who was a school teacher in the mountains too. And back in the 90s, about 94, 95, there was a show called Christy. And it was about a young girl who, at the turn of the century, who went to the mountains of North Carolina to teach in a school in the Appalachian Mountains. While she was there, she met a young minister who was there to teach, who was there to preach in the local church. And as the seasons went by, they actually became engaged. So then I'm hearing the story. I remember seeing that, but then I start hearing this story, and the family starts saying, while he was in the mountains, he met a young school teacher. We don't know her name, from Lumberton, North Carolina, and they fell in love. Okay. So when Joseph sent word Julius came to get him and to bring him home, she came home with him. On the way back, they stopped in Lumberton, North Carolina. She was going to get with her family. Then she was going to come down and help take care of Joseph. By the time they got Joseph home, he was so sick from TB that they knew there was no nursing him back to health. So what they did is they sent word to her and told her, you need to come now. She never got the message, but her and her family were on their way to come and see him. So the day of the funeral, they were in the cemetery having the funeral, and they look, and here comes the carriage. And it was his girlfriend. She made it just in time for his funeral that day. But after hearing that story, and then I started watching Christy, I started seeing, I'm wondering if they got the idea from a story or something from that, because it was too eerily close to exactly what happened. Or the family member that was telling me this story also liked the show Christy and said that sounded good. No, we never know. I'm sticking with the facts, the way that sounds. As a minister, Uncle Joseph enjoyed getting his congregation in uncomfortable traps. Once he asked his flock, all who have read the book of Hezekiah, hands up. A dozen hands or more went up in the congregation. He then made those that put up their hands foolish when he told them, turn to the index in your Bible and find the book Hezekiah. There is no book Hezekiah. So he liked to trap people like that. But Uncle Joseph died in 1902, and he's buried in the family cemetery. Alfred and Polly's next son was Julius Bennett, who was my great-grandfather. And we're going to talk a little bit more about him in just a moment. The youngest child of Alfred and Polly was George, and he lived only a few hours after his birth and is credited with starting the family cemetery in 1872, which is today known as the Manley Bennett Cemetery. And I forgot to turn this up. Here is a picture of Uncle Joseph just before he went to the mountains around 1900, 1901. All right. So, like I said, as you can tell, all the daughters married Mint's brothers or cousins. Two of the sisters, Maggie and Mary, married the same guy, Sam Mintz, and then Uncle Sam ended up outliving them. Another story in the family that I thought was interesting, Alfred wanted to provide a good education for all of his children. However, Polly wasn't too keen on her daughters going to school. They would send the sons, but the daughters didn't need to go to school. Why do they need learning, is what Polly used to say. So Alfred and Polly came up with an idea. Before the girls could go to school, they had to knit a sock each night. If they completed knitting their sock, they could go to school the next day. If they didn't knit a sock, they couldn't go to school. So all the girls learned the tricks on how to knit socks really quick so they could get it done. And the lady I got this information from, she told me that she said her grandmother could turn out a sock in an hour. Just boom, boom, and she's watched her do it from that. During the Civil War, Alfred volunteered in Company K, 36th Regiment of North Carolina Troops, which is the 2nd Regiment of North Carolina Artillery, on August 26, 1863, at the age of 43. He was stationed at Fort Caswell and Fort Campbell, where he used his carpentry skills to help fortify and build the forts. He was present and accounted for through August of 1864, where, according to company muster rolls, he was sick in the hospital in Smithfield in July of 1864. He was later released from service and returned home. Alfred died in 1895 at the age of 75, and as the story goes, he died in one of the upstairs bedrooms of his son Julius's house. The stairs were too narrow to bring the coffin up, so what they did is they brought the body downstairs and they held the funeral out on the front porch. Then with all the family standing around the yard, and then after the funeral, on the porch, they took him out to Manly Bennett Cemetery and buried him.
What was his name again?
Alfred Bennett.
Alfred.
Yeah, this man right here. And this is a picture
He joined Company K, Artillery.
Yeah, let me make sure. Company K, 36th Regiment, North Carolina Troops. It was known as the Brunswick Artillery. That's what it was known as.
I believe that was the same group that the Bennett that I mentioned and Kip Bland was in.
And most of that regiment was where all the Bennetts went. Were in that one.
My grandfather was in that same. Dan Nance was in that.
Oh, okay.
Same unit.
And the interesting thing, and I wish Mr. King was here tonight. Back in 1984, when I joined Sons of the Confederacy, all I knew were the names. I knew nothing about regiments or anything. I just wrote a letter to them, and a gentleman by the name of Lee Connor, who was the commander of George Davis Camp No. 5, he sent me a letter, and it said, Glenn Key from Winnebago, look this up for you. He found, and I threw in some other family members and all that, but he was the one who gave me all of that information, and there's the letter, or a copy of the letter, that was sent to me talking about Mr. Key actually doing all the research for Alfred. And that's how I became a member of Sons of the Confederacy, is because of that research. That is a picture of Julius Bennett's house. It was built in 1895, and right there in front of the door, you're going to see is where, that's not a picture of the coffin, but that's where the coffin laid, and then all the family stood around outside.
That's like a good idea.
So, let's see. Polly Bennett, his wife, died in 1898 and was buried beside Alfred in the Manly Bennett Cemetery. So that's the end of the 4th generation of Bennetts to come to Brunswick County. So the next generation was, and my great-grandfather of my line, was Benjamin Julius Bennett, his then youngest son, because the young son, John Bennett, had died. So Julius was the baby of the family, and everybody made big over Julius, from what I've been told. Alfred and Polly's youngest surviving son was Benjamin Julius Bennett, or Julius, as everyone called him. He was born August 25th, 1870, and he did something amazing. He married out of the family. He didn't marry a Mintz. He didn't marry a Long. He didn't marry anybody from Brunswick County. He married Mary Ella Hardwick in 1895, who was the daughter of John and Mary Ann Gore Hardwick of Loris, South Carolina. So he said none of these Mintzes, Longs, everything. Granny Julius was a businessman, and he had a lot of interest around, and he did business with some people in Loris. On his way to Loris one day, he stopped at a house to see if he could get water for his horse and for him. He knocked on the door, just typical romantic fashion. Ella opened the door and he fell in love right then and said and told himself, that's the woman I'm going to marry. So later on, after about a year or so, they were married. Julius was also a well-educated man and taught school for 7 years at Mill Creek School, which was in Mincetown. Now, Mincetown is up in Ash area, and it's up the Mill Creek Road. And this is a picture of Granddaddy Julius in front of the Mill Branch School. All of the children are his nieces and nephews. Every single one. There were no outside children. They were all his relatives out there. So that, and I found a lady that I became connected with is the one who actually had this picture. So,
And Julius' father was
Alfred.
Alfred.
So, and in addition to being a well-educated businessman, he was a businessman. In 1892, he opened a general store, which was located at what is today Hickman Road and Shingle Tree Road. A few of the items he sold in his store included bottles of ink, liver tablets, yards of ticking, starch, children's shoes, sugar, kerosene, women's dresses, blankets, books, and worm killing. So, Joyce's store also became a center of the community, which was known at this time as New Iredell, or today Hickman's Crossroads. A post office was established in the area, and Julius was named postmaster in 1903. Julius and Ella had 3 children: Joseph Layton, John Manley, and an infant daughter who died in 1906. In 1907, Julius contracted typhoid fever and died in June of that year. When asked if Manley, who was his only surviving child, remembered anything about his father, Granddaddy was 4 at the time of his death. Manley only remembered seeing his body laid out on a table and men were shaving him and preparing the body for burial. Now, as a little side note, after Granddaddy Joyce's death, Ella married William Henry McLamb in 1909. He was the son of Louis and Mary McLamb. Now, this caused quite the scandal in the community because back in those days, a wife was supposed to mourn her husband for 3 years. So here is this man. She's married only not even 2 years after Julius died. And to add to that, he was a clerk in Julius's store. And to make it even better, he was 12 years younger than her. So that all the tongues were wagging. There were people talking about what was going on. But there was another interesting story. When William Henry proposed to Ella, she had her doubts, but she told him that he needed to go away for 1 year and not have any contact with her at all. If after 1 year he still wanted to marry her, she would accept his proposal. So William Henry left and moved to Florida and stayed for 1 year. On the anniversary of that day when she sent him away, William Henry came back, proposed, and Ella agreed to marry him. On that day, they were married. William and Ella had their picture taken. Okay? What they did is they went to Conway, they went to the Justice of the Peace, and then they went afterwards and had a photograph taken. Amongst the others, wax, scandal, people talking and everything, they all said Ella's wedding dress was black. Yes, because she was still in mourning for her husband. So her wedding dress and her veil were all black. So, don't know. Nobody was there, had no clue. if that was true or not, but I'd always heard that story when I was doing my digging for all this. The Ella's wedding dress was black.
Was William Henry a McGlam?
He's a McLam, yes.
Where was Julius's store?
It was on Hickman Road.
Did they refer to it as New Iredale?
That whole area was known as New Iredale.
Okay.
Where was the old Iredale?
It was the same area. It just in Alfred's time and Samuel's time, it was old Iredale. In Julius's time, and even today, if you look on MapQuest, it shows New Iredale. It still shows. Nobody knows why it's called Iredale. Nobody can figure it out, but it was called
I've got an
Iredale.
early 1900 map that shows the Shallotte Iredale Road,
Uh-huh.
which went above the swamp
Mhm.
and connected into Ash Little River Road above the swamp.
Right.
And there was a post office up there. My friend Dan Hickman has a picture of his uncle that taught school at the old Iredale.
Uncle Raleigh. Raleigh Hickman.
Raleigh, probably.
That was my great uncle.
Okay, but he taught school at the old Iredale.
Oh yeah, the Iredale School. Yeah, and that's that's how the school got its name. It's because the place was called Iredale. But like I said, nobody knows why it's called Iredale.
It's
just one of those
interesting
things.
if you look at, the map appears to be what was called, we called it when I was growing up in the 50s, Old Shallotte Road.
Uh-huh.
And it comes to a dead stop at 904,
Mm-hmm.
which is real odd. In those days, you didn't have direct connections.
Right.
Everything veered off in one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
You have Y's, but nothing came to a dead stop. But that I'm quite sure that old Shallotte Road actually continued on to
It probably did.
to Iredale,
Mm-hmm.
the old Iredale.
Right. So, but yeah, after they got married, they went to the Justice of the Peace in Conway and got married, and the scandal was her wedding dress was black. So years later, I was connected with a lady named Miss Marguerite Faircloth. She and her husband, Troy Faircloth, bought her grandmother's home. Her grandmother was Olive Bennett, which was Julius's sister. She bought the house from her uncle, and her uncle just took what he wanted and left. It was everything set up just like when her grandmother had it. Dishes in the cabinet, furniture, pictures on the wall, and everything. And in a hall closet of that house, she had her grandmother's box of pictures. So that's how I got Joseph's picture. That's where Alfred and Polly came from. And that's where Uncle Jackson's picture came from. She had all of Julius's brothers and sisters. And actually, this is a picture of Benjamin Julius. And that's where I got the picture of him from. Is that one right there. And this is actually the wedding picture of Julius and Ella.
Black dress.
Is how that. This was when Julius, this was later, a little bit later, when they had their wedding photograph, but it was taken after they were married. This isn't Ella and William Henry. So Miss Marguerite would dig out all these pictures, and I had fun. I wish I had gotten more and had copies made. But one time I went visiting, she said, I found a picture in my mother's trunk I want to show you to see if you know who these people are. So I was like, okay. So she comes back with a picture and hands it to me. I look at it, and the first thing I do is I yell out, her wedding dress was black. It was black. She has the picture of Mr. Henry and Grandma Ella when they got married. And that's the copy. At the bottom of the photograph, this is from the 90s, so it's a little rough. But at the bottom of the photograph was the stamp for the photography studio, and it was in Conway, South Carolina, exactly where they said. So I'm sitting there going, her wedding dress was black. And Miss Marguerite looks at her husband. Miss Troy looks at her. They look back at me, and I was like, okay, let me tell you the story. And so I told her the story, and she was, well, I've never heard that. She said, I didn't know who this was. She said, but she's like, if you want to make a copy of it, you can take it. And I was like, darn it, I wanted the original. But she let me take the copy or take the original, and I had a copy made. Miss Marguerite's passed away and her husband, but their daughter still lives in the house, the last I heard several years ago. And I keep wanting to try and get back in touch with her so I can go digging in that box and get some more pictures. Oh, if you hadn't asked me, I could have told you. It'll come to me in a minute. I'll be able to tell you. So, but yes, that proved her wedding dress was black from that. So, of course, when I came home, I come running in the house, because I was in college when that happened at UNCW. So I went visiting Miss Maggie. I went home to eat supper, and Mama cooked supper for me, and then I was going back. And I walked in, I was like, Mama, her wedding dress was black. And Mama was like, okay, there's your supper. Let's sit down and get you anyway. She could care less about it. So, but I love that picture just because of that story. Ella and William Henry had 4 children. Genis Meade McLam, and he became a prominent minister here in Brunswick and Horry in Columbus County. William Lloyd, Bernice, and she died when she was 1 year old, and then they had an infant daughter. Ella died in 1959 at the age of 86, and William Henry died in 1966. They were both buried in the Manly Bennett Cemetery. Ella lies in the middle with Julius on one side and William Henry on the other side for that. Now, as a little side note, Mr. Allen McLam, who was William Henry's brother, was the father of the gentleman who founded all the McLam construction companies that were here in the southern part of the county. Also note that William Henry and Allen McLam's sister, Emma McLam, also married Robert Allen Bennett, and their son, Robert Benjamin Bennett, was the founder of Bennett's Calabash Seafood and Benjamin Calabash Seafood. So we have the connection from Benjamin, which was Alfred's brother, and then William Henry's sister married Benjamin's son, or grandson, Robert.
So that WJ's family?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay, so I wonder if his name was William Julius.
I don't remember what the J stood for,
Yeah, I mean,
but they've got a building, WJ and Sybil McLam, that's of the same family. Allen was his father, and his mother was Polly Gore Bennett. And they lived right behind our property, where I live today, further up the field, as they used to say, was where they were located from that. All right, so that kind of ends the 4th generation of Bennett. The next generation, or the 5th one, Joyce and Ella's only surviving son was John Manley Bennett. He was born in 1903, and he married Beulah Nanny Long, who was a daughter of Lorenza Dow and Lucy Iretta Hickman Long. Lorenzo's father was Joseph Brandy Long, and his wife was Lydia Margaret McLam, and was the son of Gabriel and Catherine Jimrette Long, and brother to Alfred Bennett's wife, Mary Polly Long. So Lorenzo's father and Julius's father, Alfred, were actually first cousins. So that would make Manley and Beulah, his wife, second cousins, which that's my joke when I tell people that my grandparents are second cousins. They just look at me and say, that explains a lot. That really does.
The church is named after her?
Actually, it's not. Everybody has always thought that and said that, because my grandparents gave the land that the church is sitting on. And actually, 100 years ago, in September of 1924, they gave the acre of land for the church. It was located over on Highway 17 at the end of Shingle Tree Road. It was located there. And in 1907, they voted to move the church to the present location. In 1924, they took the church apart, board by board, brick by brick, numbered it, loaded onto wagons, and hauled it from 17 over to Hickman Road, and then put it back together, following the numbers for everything. And And I talked to a couple people whose fathers were the ones that actually did the work on that, and they said they put it back in a snap. They took it down one day and church was back up the next day from that. On another note, Lucy Iretta Hickman Long was the daughter of Thomas and Nancy Marlowe Hickman of Hickman's Crossroads, and the crossroads was named after her family. Nancy Marlowe Hickman was from Old Dock, North Carolina in Columbus County. When she married Thomas Hickman in 1864, part of her dowry were several enslaved African Americans, one of whom was named Hattie Bell Marlowe. And down in the southern part, there is a group of black Marlows, African American Marlows. I've talked to several of them, they can all trace their line back to Hattie Bell. So that is how the Marlowe family came to Brunswick County. On another side note, the Hickmans are also intertwined with the Milligan family of Brunswick County. Moses and Mary Milligan's granddaughter, Margaret, who was the daughter of Benjamin Moses and Elizabeth Milligan, married Samuel Hickman. Samuel Hickman was the father of Isaac Hickman. Their son Isaac was then the father of Thomas Hickman, who married Nancy Marlowe. Just an interesting fact, there is a Hickman cemetery located Hickman's Crossroads on Hickman Branch. That's what it's called. And it was started because Isaac wanted to be buried next to his dog. According to the story, he loved his dog more than anything in the world. And when the dog died, he mourned him. So his story was, I want to be buried beside my dog. I want to be buried with him. So when he died, they buried him. So way back when I took my grandmother to the cemetery and trying to figure out who everybody was of the Hickmans that were buried out there, Grandma said, this is Granddaddy Thomas Hickman, and that's his daddy Isaac, and here's Grandma Hickman, and she goes through and points everybody out. And there's a stick sticking up out of the dirt beside Isaac's grave. I said, well, what's the stick? She said, oh, that's his dog. And just walked off. And then I was like, his dog. And then she told me the story that Isaac started the cemetery because he wanted to be buried beside his dog. And all the Hickmans have been buried there, except there's some Hickmans in the Manley Bennett Cemetery and around, but the majority of them are buried in that cemetery.
Do you know if that Thomas Hickman was one of the few survivors of Elmira prison?
He was. He was one of the. He was captured at Fort Fisher, went to Elmira, and he came back. And the story was he never recovered from the war, and he died in 1887. He worked himself to death trying to provide for his family from that. But yeah, my grandmother told me stories that when she was a little girl, Grandma Hickman, his wife, Thomas's wife, would stand while she was cooking and tell all the grandchildren stories about Granddaddy Tom being in the war and about how he told about being in a prison camp and stuff like that. And then later on, when I was doing my digging, that's when I found out that he died there. A cousin of mine, Hickman, he lives in Wilmington. He did a bunch of research.
You talk about Dan Hickman?
Don Hickman, yes, that's him. Don Hickman, that's him. Right.
He's on our board of, is he still on our board of trustees? Okay.
So, yeah. So Manly and Beulah, and these are pictures of Manly and Beulah. Here is a picture of Manly, and there is the picture of Beulah. These are my grandparents from there. So, that's right there.
That's the original.
Yeah, those are the original ones, yeah.
Maiden name.
Her maiden name was Long.
Long. Okay.
Once again, Bennett's married their Mintz or Long cousins. So, Manly and Beulah had 3 sons. One, an infant son who died in 1926. Their second son was Dally Emery Bennett, who was born in 1927, and he married Gladys Roebuck of Robertsonville, North Carolina. She was the daughter of Lester Cornelius and Verena Coburn Roebuck. They had 3 children. Danny Emery Bennett, who married Sonia Kelly, who was from Bolton, North Carolina, and she was the daughter of Burris and Dale Kelly, and they had one son named Michael. Their second child was Connie Lynn, and she's sitting right here in front of me. And their third child was John Allen. Okay. And Emery met Aunt Gladys when she taught school out at Charlotte High School, middle school. She taught elementary school. And in the old school was here, there was a little brick building over to the right side. That was a dormitory for teachers. That's where she stayed.
Teacherage.
Yeah. So that's where she stayed through when she was teaching school out there. So they kind of met through friends and stuff while she was teaching out there.
Was she married, or what was her name again?
Gladys Roebuck.
Gladys Roebuck.
And she married Emery, Dally Emery Bennett, or Emery Bennett.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So, and when she was Roebuck, and so when her mother, we always called her Grandma Roebuck, because Connie and them would call her Grandma, so everybody just called her Grandma Roebuck. When I was little, my sister and my cousin would poke me and say, go ask Grandma Roebuck if she'll get you something from the catalog. The Sears and Roebuck catalog. So me, when I was 3 and 4 and 5 coming along, they would say, go ask her. Go ask her. And he'd tell you found something in the catalog, and can she get it for you? Yeah, there was a lot of stories they did, me being the youngest one of them all. So, the next child of Manley and Beulah was Wendell Eugene Bennett, and he was born in 1934. He married Annie Ruth Long of Longwood, and they had, of course, 2 children. Now, once again, the Bennett married Long. So, finally, I'm hoping somebody will break that in our line. So, their 2 children were Susan Lenora and David Wendell, myself, from that. So, a little interesting tidbit on Annie Ruth Long, family in Longwood. Her parents were Vincent and Maddie Register Long, and Vincent's parents were William Asbury Jinks Long and Bessie Lee Butler. Jinks Long is who Longwood is named after. And his family were originally from around Seaside. They owned property from Ocean Isle Beach all the way through Seaside to Sunset Beach and over to the old Georgetown Road.
That must have been the Bland. That was the Bland.
I think there were Brooks down there too. Right, the Brooks family. But they owned all that property around there. But it was sand. It was, you couldn't grow anything. Nothing was worth it.
But
that's true. You could get seafood and stuff from there, but as far as farm, you couldn't make any money off of it. So it was really worthless. Jinks was a clerk in a store that was located there in Surfside, in Seaside, owned by the Brooks family. So he heard of property up in what was Butler Pond, which is now Longwood. And he heard that there was all this timber and stuff up there, and they wanted to open a store. The Brooks family wanted to open a store there. So they sent Jinks up to that area and opened the store. A lady came in one day with her mother named Bessie Lee Butler. And he looked at her and said, oh, okay. He asked around about her, and everybody told her, that's the granddaughter of Daniel Butler. She's going to inherit 1,500 acres of prime timberland up around Butler Pond. Well, shortly after that, Jinks proposed to Bessie, and Bessie accepted him. Now, whether it was true love or it was the fact that she was getting 1,500 acres of timberland in just a couple of years, nobody knows. But they were married in 1907. And that's where Longwood came from, or the idea of Longwood was because of that. If you watch WECT News, when they do the weather spot, they always, when they're from Ocean Isle Beach, they always talk about a Jinx Creek.
Yeah.
That used to be called Jinx Landing, and that was Granddaddy Jinx's property. He owned all, he know that, and it was named after him. My mother told me that story. It was Jinx Landing, but I guess they wanted to fancy it up and made it Jinx Creek. But every time I see that creek, that picture, I always go, my family owned that. We could have had that. But today, not much property is very valuable in Longwood, but all along seaside, it's about 1,000 times what it was back then. So, but anyway, so that is going through 5 and 6 generations. This is Wendell and his wife Annie Ruth, which was Manly and Beulah's son, and this is a smaller picture of Emery and his wife Gladys. And then this is a picture of Emery and Wendell. That one's broke, but there's that one there. So
It's one of those Henry's mom and daddy.
yeah, this one right here is Emery's mom and daddy, Manly and Beulah.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
okay. So that is my little family from the southern part of Brunswick County. So, do you have any questions or anything else you want to know?
Can you explain about the Milliken family again?
Oh, okay.
Figure out if I'm related to Buddy. You were going
You
so
all
fast.
because he was
All right,
fast.
I'll read slow.
Explain how we're related.
Okay.
Any prison terms involved.
Anything bad about him, don't tell.
Okay, so the Hickmans and the Milligans are intertwined.
Okay.
Moses and Mary Milligans, which were supposed to be like the first Milligans really to come to Brunswick County,
K-E-N.
are in there. I'm sorry.
Spell
Well,
K-E-N.
in one family, it was my grandparents were Miller. My grandparents were Milligan.
G-A-N.
And G-A-N.
Uh-huh.
But once over there at Slope Point was one of his brothers, and they were K-E-N.
Okay.
So that,
Well, in the old papers that I had, it was spelled Milligan is how they spelled it.
yes.
But Moses and Mary Milligan, their granddaughter, Margaret, who was the daughter of Benjamin Moses and Elizabeth Milligan, was the one who married Samuel Hickman. And that Samuel was the first Hickman to come to Brunswick County that we know of.
Moses was G-A-N.
Right. That's what according to in the old papers, it was G-A-N.
Wonder how
We didn't know.
Well, and that's another thing.
They're all interrelated.
That's another thing. Bennett was spelled B-E-N-E-T-T. B-E-N-E-T. It went B-E-N-N-E-T-T-E. And in the cemetery, Joyce's brothers are T-T-E. Joyce has no E at the end. So now from that point on, all the Bennetts dropped the E. Something happened around that generation that they dropped the E. So if they were tired of writing out such a long last name or what.
Now, Dale Bennett, is his mom and daddy up there? I mean,
Dale Bennett's family was the Robert Benjamin and who married Emmeline Tharp, Miss Emma Tharp. That was his grandparents.
So with Bennett, it's kind of say it was English that derived English. I just wondered if it was ever suspected to be French pronounced Bennett.
Well, I always thought that because the B-E-N-E-T, but everything I've found is it was English and Southern Ireland is where the Bennetts came from. There's supposed to be a castle in Southern Ireland, a Bennett castle, but everything that I've been able to find was they came from England from that. But you never know. They could have started in France and then came over 1,000 years ago or something.
The Hickmans were German.
Yeah, they were Scotch. But the Mintz, through the Mintzes, were German. So that's where a German bloodline comes in.
How does Eddie Bennett fit into this over on Thomasburg Road?
Eddie Bennett is the son of Robert Bennett, or he was known as R.B. Bennett, and Dorothy Rees Bennett. That's his son. His great grandfather was Benjamin Bennett, who was brother to Alfred Bennett.
I see. You know, your uncle probably got his morphine, and morphine was easy to get back in that day. He probably got his morphine from the John McNeil, who was a pharmacist in Little River, Charlotte, and then forged the river to Whiteville in the 1800s.
That was the thing. Nobody knew where he just got it. I know before Uncle Jackson died, he was going through withdrawals so bad that William Henry went to Little River and got morphine. I do remember hearing that story, and brought it back to him and gave it to him to ease him out because he was having so much pain from that. But thank you for the name of the pharmacy. That's good to know. I'll have to add that in there.
It's McNeil, McNeill. Of course, they've been in the pharmacy business for many, many years, but they started in Little River and ended up in Charlotte, and then forged on across the river back in that day during a hurricane, I believe, to Whiteville.
Okay. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. All right. Any other questions? Yes. That's it. Thank you for listening to my. All right.